The most expensive mistake of billionaire Alastair Vance's life wasn't a bad stock trade or a failed merger. No, his greatest error was one born of ego, a simple decision he made on a Tuesday evening to give a personal tour of his private art collection. You see, Alastair Vance didn't just collect art, he conquered it. His mansion wasn't a home. It was a fortress of solitude built from marble and money, a monument to a man who owned everything except a soul. And tonight, he was about to be reminded of the one thing he could never truly possess. His audience for this grand tour? A young woman named Kemi Adebayo. She was a brilliant intern from his own charity foundation, sharp as a tack, and possessing an authenticity that was completely, gloriously out of place amidst all the gilded perfection. While Alastair saw art as assets, Kemi saw the stories they held. And she was about to find a story that would shatter his entire world. Can you imagine the scene? The mighty billionaire playing the gracious host and the observant intern, about to become the protagonist of her own shocking drama. So there he was, leading her through the cavernous West Wing gallery, pointing out a Monet with all the passion of someone reading a cereal box. It was just another trophy. But Kemi's eyes, sharp and discerning, slid right past the million-dollar masterpiece. They were pulled, as if by a magnetic force, to a small, modestly framed photograph tucked away between a vibrant Picasso and a brooding Van Gogh. It was an anomaly, a quiet whisper in a room screaming with wealth. Narrator. And in that moment, the air left Kemi's lungs. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, narrowing down to that single, impossible image. It was a photograph of a woman with skin like rich mahogany and a smile so warm, so genuine, it could disarm the sun itself. Her head was wrapped in a vibrant gelly, a splash of brilliant color and life. It was her mother. This wasn't just a picture. It was a ghost, a beloved memory she thought was locked away in a childhood album in a small apartment thousands of miles away. So what in the world was it doing here, in this cold, sterile palace? The disconnect was so violent it was dizzying. Alastair Vance, ever the showman, noticed her fixed gaze. He misinterpreted her shock for admiration. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Ah, that," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "An anomaly in the collection, I admit. Not worth millions on the open market, but that smile." He paused, almost himself. "It captivated me at an auction in Lagos years ago. I just had to have it." He said it like he was talking about a unique trinket, a curious bauble. Little did he know, he was holding a lit match over a powder keg of buried history. Kemi's voice, when it finally came, was low, but it cut through the silence like a trembling blade. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice trembling with the effort to stay calm. "Where did you get that photograph?" He started to repeat his rehearsed line, like I said, an auction in, but she cut him off. Now, interrupting Alastair Vance was a feat few in the corporate world dared. It was professional suicide. But in this moment, Kemi wasn't an intern. She was a daughter. "No." The single word echoed in the vast space. She turned fully to him, and the storm in her eyes finally broke, a torrent of confusion, betrayal, and a righteous anger that had been building for seconds that felt like lifetimes. "Why?" she demanded, her voice cracking with emotion. "Is my mom's photo in your mansion?" The air in the gallery didn't just get quiet, it crackled with static electricity. Alastair Vance, a man who commanded international boardrooms with a mere whisper, a man whose every nod could shift markets, was utterly, completely, and totally shocked. He was a statue of a billionaire, frozen in the spotlight of a truth he never saw coming. What would he possibly say? How could he explain the ghost from his past, now standing before him in the form of a furious young woman? The answers are even more shocking than the question. But that's a story for the next chapter. The billionaire's composure shattered like glass. The polished facade he presented to the world crumbling into 1,000 sharp pieces. Preposterous. The word exploded from him, too loud, too sharp for the hallowed quiet of the gallery. It was the sound of a man whose control was slipping, a knee-jerk denial against an impossible truth. That's impossible. Her name was Adana. He stated it as a final, unassailable fact, a piece of data he had stored away 3 decades ago. The seller assured me she had no family. He said this as if it settled the matter, as if the word of some anonymous auctioneer in a Lagos market could overwrite the lived reality of the young woman standing before him. But Kemi Adebayo was not swayed by the bluster of a billionaire. His denial only fanned the flames of her certainty. Her name was Adana Adebayo. She fired back, her voice no longer trembling but steadying with a fierce, unshakable pride. She injected the full weight of their name, their legacy, into the space between them, a legacy he had reduced to a mere curiosity. She was a nurse, a healer. She died when I was 8 years old. With every word, she painted a picture of a real, breathing life, a life of service and love that stood in stark contrast to his cold collection of objects. And that photo, she continued, her gaze unwavering, was taken 2 weeks before her cancer diagnosis. It was the last photo where her smile still reached her eyes. It was never sold. It could never be sold. The finality in her voice was absolute. It was in her personal album, a private treasure, which disappeared from our home in Lagos after her funeral. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. It hadn't just vanished. It had been taken. Can you even imagine the sheer, gut-wrenching irony of this moment? Here, in this temple of purchased beauty, surrounded by masterpieces worth more than most people see in a lifetime, the one piece that held no monetary value was the one that now held the power to completely unravel him. This wasn't a painting he could loan to a museum or a sculpture he could insure. This was a stolen memory, a ghost he had unknowingly invited into his home, and it had just stood up and spoken its name. The initial shock that had frozen Alistair Vance now began to curdle, transforming into something darker, something more insidious. A cold, gripping fear that started in the pit of his stomach and began to spread its icy fingers through his veins. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and strategy, became a chaotic whirlwind of questions. If the seller had lied about this, what else had they lied about? What other foundations of his carefully constructed narrative were built on sand? The photograph was no longer just a picture. It was a key, and Kemi had just used it to unlock a door he had sealed shut 30 years ago. And now that door was creaking open, threatening to unleash truths he had long since buried. What else didn't he know? What other consequences from a forgotten past were waiting in the shadows, ready to step into the light and demand a reckoning? The fear was no longer about being caught in a lie. It was about the terrifying realization that his entire understanding of a pivotal moment in his life was a fiction, and the real story was standing right in front of him, and it was armed with the truth. The silence that followed was thicker and heavier than any of the velvet ropes guarding his priceless art. Without a word, his grand explanations dying in his throat, Alistair Vance turned and led Kemi away from the public gallery of his achievements and into the private sanctum of his shame. He took her to his study, a room that felt like the inside of a haunted heart. It smelled of old leather-bound books and even older secrets, a place where the air itself felt heavy with things left unsaid. The journey down the corridor was a silent procession, a complete and total inversion of their previous roles. Just minutes ago, he had been the beneficent king showing a peasant his treasures. Now, he was a man being led to his own interrogation. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had shattered. The young intern, clutching the photograph of her mother like a sacred relic, was now the inquisitor, and the billionaire in his palatial home was the one on trial. He sank into the worn leather of his high-backed chair, the expensive material groaning under his weight, and for the first time, he looked every one of his 60 years and more. The carefully maintained veneer of ageless power had cracked, revealing the tired, weathered man beneath. The opulence of the room, the gilded frames, and the mahogany desk now seemed to mock him rather than celebrate him. Kemi stood before him, not sitting, her posture straight and unyielding. The storm in her eyes had settled into a hard, focused resolve. She was no longer just a grieving daughter. She was the sole representative of her mother's legacy, and she would not be placated or dismissed. "Tell me," she demanded, her voice low but ringing with absolute authority. It was the voice of a single mother's daughter, a voice that had learned resilience as a first language and knew how to fight for what was rightfully hers. She would not back down, not until every last grain of truth had been unearthed from the tomb of his past. Alistair let out a long, shaky breath, the sound terribly loud in the quiet room. He gestured weakly, a vague, sweeping motion that encompassed the entire obscene wealth of the mansion surrounding them. "I wasn't always this," he began, the words tasting foreign and pathetic on his tongue. He was admitting that the persona of Alistair Vance, the titan of industry, was a costume, and a recently donned one at that. 30 years ago, he continued, his gaze drifting to a distant, painful memory. "I was a desperate young man in Lagos. I was arrogant, yes, but also naive. I had staked everything on my first major deal, convinced it was my birthright." He gave a bitter, hollow laugh. "I was cheated, left with absolutely nothing. No money, no contacts, no pride. The memory of that failure, even after all these years, had the power to make him flinch. And then, to make a catastrophic situation utterly hopeless, I became desperately unwell. A severe, brutal case of malaria. I was burning up with fever, delirious, and completely alone in a city that had just eaten me alive. I remember the world spinning, the ground rushing up to meet me, and then nothing. I collapsed right in the middle of a bustling market, surrounded by strangers who simply stepped over me." He looked then at the photograph Kemi held so protectively in her hands, as if drawing strength from the image of the woman within it. "And then a woman found me." His voice softened, filled with a reverence that was entirely new. "Adana." He spoke the name not as a forgotten fact from an auction catalog, but as a real, breathing person. She was a stranger. She had no reason to care for a fallen foreigner. But she did. She didn't step over me. She knelt. She got me to my feet, half-carried me to a nearby clinic, a place she probably knew we could afford. She paid for my treatment with money she likely couldn't spare, money meant for her own family, for her own daughter. He met Kemi's eyes then, his own glistening with the long-buried emotion of that day. And she didn't just leave me there. She stayed. She sat with me for hours in that cramped clinic, a complete stranger, until my fever broke and I was stable. She brought me water. She spoke quiet, calming words I was too sick to understand, but could feel in my soul. He let the weight of that statement hang in the air between them, the truth of it finally breaking free from the prison of his ego. She saved my life. The confession hung in the perfumed air of the study, a stark and ugly truth finally spoken aloud after festering in silence for 30 long years. Alistair continued, his voice thick with a shame he had so carefully buried beneath layers of wealth and influence, a corrosive guilt that now rose to the surface to choke him. When I recovered, when I was finally strong enough to stand on my own 2 feet, the very first thing I did was go back. I had to find her. I had to thank her, to properly repay her for what she had done. He remembered the burning determination, the pure, uncomplicated gratitude that had fueled his steps back through that market, the one decent impulse he could recall from that entire wretched period of his life. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. But she was gone. The words were flat, heavy with the echo of a long-ago disappointment that had curdled into something much darker over time. The room where she had lived was empty. A neighbor, seeing me loitering, took pity on me. She said Adana's family had been forced to move away suddenly, a common story of hardship and displacement. There was no forwarding address, no hint of where they might have gone. He described the scene as if he were still standing there, a confused and heartbroken young man staring at a void where his savior had been. And all that was left, he whispered, his eyes fixed on the photograph in Kemi's hands, was a small box. It had been placed outside her empty room, filled with items deemed unimportant, left behind in the rush or considered not worth the cost of carrying. Trinkets, a few papers, memories that no longer had a home. In this photo, he said, pointing a trembling finger, was right there on top. And then came the most difficult admission of all, the moment where gratitude had twisted into something selfish and irrevocable. He had taken it. In that moment of loss and desperation, he had reached out and claimed the only piece of Adana he could find. He had plucked her image from a box of discarded memories and walked away with it. It became his twisted talisman, his dark secret. He framed it not as a celebration of her, but as a morbid reminder of a debt he could never repay, a permanent monument to his own vulnerability and the one time he had been at the absolute mercy of another's kindness. He built his entire empire in the shadow of that unpaid debt, amassing fortunes that could have lifted entire nations, yet he never once mounted a serious, determined search for the woman to whom he owed everything. The question hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. Why? Why would a man with limitless resources not seek to settle the single, most important account of his life? The answer was simple and pathetic. Because truly confronting that past meant confronting the man he was before the money, a frightened, desperate, helpless young man who had been saved by a stranger's compassion. It meant admitting that the powerful Alistair Vance, the billionaire who commanded fear and respect, was built upon the foundation of a broken boy who had stolen a photograph that was not his to take. He had chosen to live with the ghost rather than face the living truth, because the ghost asked no questions and demanded no explanations. Kemi listened to this entire sordid tale, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. "You stole her picture," she whispered, the words barely audible, the hurt behind them so profound it was almost quiet, which made it all the more powerful. She looked from the face of her smiling mother to the broken man before her, trying to reconcile the two realities. "You took this from a box of things left behind. You became one of the richest men in the world, with private investigators and resources beyond imagination, and it never once occurred to you to find her family? To find me?" Her voice began to rise, trembling with a fresh wave of grief, not for the mother she lost, but for the story that had been stolen from her. "To find me and look me in the eye and tell me that my mother was a hero, that she died saving a life, that her kindness was so powerful it echoed for decades? You owe me that story. You owed her that legacy, and instead you locked her away in a gallery like a trophy, a secret for only you to see." Alistair had no answer. There was no defense, no clever corporate spin that could justify his cowardice. He could only sit there, utterly defeated, as the weight of her words crashed down upon him. The mansion, with its soaring ceilings and priceless artifacts, this grand symbol of his immense power and success, now felt like what it had always been, a gilded prison of his own making, and he had just been presented with the bill for his life sentence. Kemi stood up, the movement final and decisive, a judge rising to deliver a verdict. She held the photograph tightly to her chest, her fingers curling protectively around the wooden frame as if she were shielding her mother's soul from this cold, gilded place. "This isn't yours," she stated, her voice devoid of its earlier fire, replaced by a chilling, devastating calm that was far more powerful than any shout could ever be. The urgency was gone, burned away by the raw truth of his confession. Her memory isn't yours to lock away in your museum. It never was. In that simple declaration, she reclaimed everything he had taken, not just the physical photo, but the narrative, the legacy, the very right to remember Adana Adebayo. This was the moment of truth, the precipice upon which the rest of both their lives would balance. The air in the study was charged with a silent, monumental question. Would the billionaire retreat? Would Alistair Vance, the titan of industry, hide behind a wall of lawyers and legalities, using his wealth as both a shield and a weapon to bury this inconvenient truth as he had buried so many other uncomfortable realities? Or would the man, the vulnerable and grateful young man who had been saved in a Lagos market 3 decades ago, the man who had been buried so deep beneath the billions and the acquisitions, finally find the strength to surface and face the consequences of his own history? Alistair Vance looked at the young woman before him, truly looked at her, And for the first time, he did not see an intern or a problem to be managed. He saw a living, breathing piece of a legacy he had believed was lost forever. He saw Adana's unwavering strength reflected in Kemi's proud posture, her profound compassion glowing in her spirit, her resilience etched into the very set of her jaw. He saw the living embodiment of the goodness he had profited from and then forgotten. In that searing moment of clarity, he understood the true cost of his empire. He had spent a lifetime acquiring things, companies, properties, art, status, but in the relentless pursuit of it all, he had carelessly lost his own humanity along the way. He had traded a debt of honor for a portfolio of assets, and he was now the poorest rich man in the world. Wait, the word escaped his lips, raw and stripped bare, a single syllable that carried the weight of his entire crumbling world. It wasn't a command. It was a plea, a desperate, last-ditch effort to stop time, to halt the finality of her exit and the eternal condemnation it represented. He moved then, walking slowly to his immense, polished desk, the symbol of his global power. His hand went instinctively, predictably, to a leather-bound checkbook, the tool he had used for decades to solve every problem, to quiet every complaint, to settle every score. But then his hand stopped. A sad, self-aware smile touched his lips, a fleeting acknowledgement of his own deeply ingrained failings. Money was the wrong language here. It was the language of the man he had become, not the man he needed to be in this moment. He threw the checkbook aside with a gesture of disgust, the pages fluttering uselessly. "Kemi," he said, his voice firmer now, cleansed and clarified by the purifying fire of total humiliation and truth. "The debt I owe you, mother, is the only one that matters. It is the foundational debt of my life. It can't be paid with money. It can never be settled with a check." He took a steadying breath, the idea forming not as a business proposition, but as a long overdue act of penance. But it can be honored. It must be honored with action. And so he proposed the Adana Adebayo Foundation. It would be fully, endlessly funded by him, every dollar of its operation drawn from his vast wealth. But it would be conceived, directed, and given soul by her, by Kemi. Its mission would be to provide health care, scholarships, and unwavering support for nurses and their children, to lift up those who, like her mother, dedicated their lives to healing others, often at great personal sacrifice. It was a way to ensure that Adana's true legacy, one of selfless compassion and everyday courage, would live on, not trapped and silenced in a gilded frame, but alive and active and powerful in the world, creating ripples of kindness for generations to come. The anger in Kemi's eyes, which had been a solid, impenetrable wall, finally softened. It did not dissolve into forgiveness. That was a bridge too far, a gift for another day. But it transformed into something perhaps more powerful in that moment. Possibility. It was the dawning light of a future where her mother's story could finally be told correctly, where her pain could be transmuted into purpose. The billionaire's initial shock had finally given way to a genuine, hard-won purpose. And in the end, surrounded by all the priceless artifacts his money could buy, the most valuable thing Alastair Vance ever found in his mansion wasn't a painting by Monet or a sculpture by Picasso. It was a second chance, and he was only just beginning to understand how much work it would take to earn it.